The meal is ready. Steam rises from a pot set over fading embers. A man tears a piece of bread and dips it into the stew. He tastes it. Something is wrong. Not spoiled. Not burnt. Just empty. Across medieval Europe, this moment was familiar. The quiet realization that food without salt felt unfinished, almost lifeless. A woman reaches for a small wooden pouch hanging near the fire. She opens it carefully, pinching only a few crystals between her fingers. Too much would be a waste. Too little would be pointless. She sprinkles it slowly. The smell changes first. Then, the taste. The entire meal wakes up. But salt was never just flavor. It preserved meat through winter. It kept fish edible for months. It allowed armies to march and ships to sail farther than fresh food should allow. And in many villages, that tiny pouch held more value than silver coins. Because if the salt ran out, the winter became dangerous. Salt did not come easily. Some places mined it deep underground, carving tunnels into ancient stone. Others gathered it from drying seawater, waiting patiently as the sun did the work. Every grain required labor, digging, boiling, scraping, carrying. Kings understood its power quickly. Taxes were built around it. Trade routes formed because of it. Entire towns existed only because salt was found nearby. In markets, merchants guarded sacks of salt like treasure. Soldiers were sometimes paid with it, a reminder that survival itself had value. But for ordinary people, salt meant something simpler. It meant food that lasted. Without it, meat rotted in days. Fish spoiled before reaching inland villages. Winter stores vanished faster than anyone could replace them. Salt didn't just improve life. It stretched over time. Autumn was a season of urgency. Animals were slaughtered before the cold deepened. Fish were cleaned and layered carefully inside wooden barrels. Salt covered everything, thick, white, and sharp against the dark flesh. Hands moved quickly. Everyone knew the stakes. The barrels would be opened months later, when fields slept under snow and hunting grew difficult. The taste would be strong, sometimes overwhelming. But it would still be food. Children learned early not to waste a single grain, because once winter arrived, no one could simply buy more. Salt became security, invisible, quiet, but always present. And in households where supplies were low, fear grew slowly with every passing week. Long before paved highways or rail lines, there were roads made for one thing: salt. Carts creaked under heavy loads, wheels cutting deep grooves into muddy paths. Horses moved slowly, breath rising in cold morning air. Guards walked beside them, watching the tree line, because everyone knew what those wagons carried. Bandits didn't always want gold. Sometimes they wanted salt more. Entire routes across Europe existed because of this trade. From coastal marshes to inland towns, from mountain mines to distant markets, salt moved constantly, grain by grain, sack by sack. Villages grew where traders stopped. Inns opened. Blacksmiths repaired broken wheels. Markets appeared where none had existed before. A single mineral reshaped the map, and the people who controlled it grew powerful. Rulers understood something simple. If you controlled salt, you controlled survival. Taxes on salt appeared everywhere. In some regions, families were forced to buy a fixed amount each year, whether they needed it or not. Officials measured, weighed, and watched closely. Smuggling became common. Small bags hidden under clothing. Secret exchanges in forests. Quiet deals made at night. Because high salt prices didn't just hurt comfort, they threatened food stores. A poor harvest could be survived if meat and fish were preserved well. Without enough salt, even a good year could end in hunger. People complained quietly. Sometimes they rebelled. But salt taxes remained, too profitable to abandon, too essential to ignore. Inside a medieval kitchen, preservation had a smell. Sharp, heavy, almost metallic. Fish hung from beams, stiff and pale. Pork rested in barrels, buried under layers of crystals. Hands worked constantly, rubbing, packing, sealing. Salt pulled moisture from food, slowing the invisible decay that everyone feared but no one fully understood. It was patience turned into survival. Weeks later, the meat would be boiled, soaked, or rinsed to soften the harsh taste. Families knew how to make it edible again. They had done it for generations. Fresh food was a luxury of summer. Salted food was the promise of tomorrow. And in a world where winters felt endless, that promise mattered more than flavor. Far from the fields, another world depended on salt. Fishing boats left before sunrise, disappearing into cold gray water. Nets came back heavy, sometimes with enough fish to feed a village, sometimes barely enough to justify the risk. Fresh fish spoiled quickly. By the time a boat reached shore, the race had already begun. Workers moved fast. Knives flashed. Barrels waited open. Salt poured over layers of fish until nothing living remained. Only preservation, silence, and time. These barrels traveled farther than the fishermen ever would. Inland towns tasted the sea without ever seeing it. Markets filled with salted cod, herring, and other fish that had crossed weeks of distance without rotting. Salt turned the ocean into a pantry. And suddenly, entire economies depended on that transformation. Not everyone tasted salt the same way. On noble tables it sat proudly in carved holders, a symbol of wealth and status. Guests seated closer to the salt were considered more important. Even placement became a quiet language of power. But in poorer homes, salt was counted carefully. A pinch for the pot. A little rubbed into meat. Nothing wasted. Sometimes families stretch it by mixing it with herbs or ash. Sometimes meals went without. Children learned early to eat slowly, to savor what little flavor there was. The difference between a seasoned stew and a bland one could change the mood of an entire evening. Salt wasn't just taste. It was dignity, the small comfort that made hard food feel human. Some years, the supply broke. Storms ruined coastal salt pans. Wars blocked trade routes. Taxes rose too high. Suddenly, what had always been available became rare. The change came quietly at first. Meat spoiled faster. Barrels smelled wrong. Winter stores shrank. People adapted, smoking food more heavily, drying it longer, stretching meals thinner, but nothing replaced salt completely. Without it, preservation became uncertain. And uncertainty meant fear. Because hunger never arrived all at once. It crept slowly, day by day, meal by meal, until people realized they were already running out. But salt remembers. It remembers kitchens filled with smoke and hunger, fishermen racing against time, traders risking robbery for a cargo that could not be eaten yet was more valuable than food itself. It remembers winters survived because barrels stayed sealed. Villages that endured because flavor and preservation walked hand in hand. For centuries, salt held together systems no one fully noticed until it was gone. And maybe that is why its story feels so human. The most important things are rarely loud. They sit quietly on the table, waiting to be needed. Today, salt sits everywhere. On restaurant tables, in kitchens bright with electric light, in packets torn open without thought. We shake it freely, rarely wondering where it came from or how hard it once was to obtain. But for most of human history, every grain carried effort. Hands that dug, fires that boiled, roads that stretched farther than anyone could walk in a day. Salt was never only a seasoning. It was insurance against hunger. A quiet promise that tomorrow's meal might still exist. People didn't admire it the way they admired gold or silk. They didn't write poems about it or build monuments in its honor. They simply relied on it. And maybe that's why its story feels familiar. The things that truly keep life together are often the ones we stop noticing. A small crystal, a simple taste, a habit passed from one generation to the next without thinking. But somewhere in that ordinary gesture, the pinch over a pot, the sprinkle over bread, echoes the memory of a world that survived because someone understood the value of something small. And long before it became ordinary, salt was the difference between hunger and hope.